Hello, welcome back. Sorry it's been such a long time in between videos. Things have happened, including COVID. So this is my follow-up video exploring Shrewsbury Cemetery. So I've already covered the war graves that are there. So this video is telling the story of some of the more interesting characters that we can find that are buried there. So I hope you enjoy it. Sit back and here we go.
The 19th century saw a huge and dramatic demographic changes in the UK, which brought with them a host of related problems. The population rose from 16 million to in excess of 40 million, and the proportion of people living in towns and cities increased from 20% to over 75%. Questions were asked as to where the dead would be buried were forced to the forefront of public debate. Many of the local traditional churchyards were full, leading to much concern. Various projects began in Shrewsbury. A development took place in Bellevue, where in 1852 the nonconformist community opened their own cemetery. Not long after the opening of the Bellevue Cemetery, Shrewsbury established its own burial board. This consisted of 9 members from each of the parishes in the town: St Mary's, St Chad's, the Abbey, St Julian's, St Altman's and Meal Brace. The cemetery was consecrated by the Bishop of Hereford on the 26th of November 1856. Although the majority of the town was in the Diocese of Lichfield, the parish of Meal Brace and the land itself was in that of Hereford. The buildings at the entrance are now much the same as originally built. 2 lodges for staff, a covered entrance and a chapel, between which is a square area surrounded by open corridors. This is believed to have been the location of the nonconformist chapel, now demolished. The person chosen to design and oversee the buildings was Samuel Pountney Smith, who we will talk about later. The first burial took place on the same day as the consecration. It was that of Gabriel Swallow, a 67-year-old gamekeeper from Castle Foregate. The burial board continued to manage the cemetery until 1909, when, with the passing of the Shrewsbury Corporation Act, responsibility passed to the Borough Council. Samuel Pountney Smith was born on the 2nd of November 1812 and died the 5th of November 1883. He was an English architect who practised mainly in Shrewsbury. Smith was a native of Munslow, where he was baptised on the 17th of December 1812. He was the son of an innkeeper, Edward Smith, and his wife Anne. He learned the trades of builder and architect with his uncle John Smallman at Quatford near Bridgnorth, and came to Shrewsbury in about 1840 after working in the latter's business. His major works were mainly in Shropshire, with occasional works in the neighbouring county of Herefordshire. He also carried out some works nearby in North Wales. An example of his Welsh work is St Colin's Church at Llangollen. According to the authors of the Buildings of England series, his work was strongly influenced by Pugin, and his designs were mainly in early English style. His output was mainly in relation to churches, designing new churches and carrying out alterations or restorations on others, his most important restoration being that of St Mary Magdalene in Battlefield. Smith also received domestic commissions to design new houses, including Llantysilio Hall, home of Charles Bayer, and to alter others, including the Limes in Bellevue in Shrewsbury, which he remodelled for his own use. He was a Justice of Peace for the Borough of Shrewsbury and was for a time a Conservative Borough Councillor, serving as Mayor of Shrewsbury in 1873-74, until narrowly losing an election in 1876. However, he was elected alderman from outside council in 1877 and served until he died 3 days before the end of his 6-year term of office. Samuel Pountney Smith died at the Limes after 3 months' paralysis in 1883, aged 71. Hans Lobenberg was born in 1896 to Jewish parents in Cologne. He served in the German Air Force in World War I and then joined in business with a Hans Blumenau. As the Jewish persecution escalated, Hans Blumenau came to England in 1936 and established a factory in King's Cross under the name Corset Silhouette. In 1938 he sponsored Hans plus his second wife Anne-Marie to leave Germany and join him in London with the business. At the beginning of the Blitz, the company was offered relocation to either Coventry or Shrewsbury. They chose wisely and came to Shrewsbury, and the two of them set up a factory and a church hall in Tankerville Street, later moving to the old waterworks in Coton Hill. As the business expanded, they established a new factory in Halscott, but whilst construction was underway in 1955, Hans Lobenberg died aged 55. As an employer, he was loved by his staff, taking pains to get to know them, remembering children's birthdays and sharing their joys and sorrows. He was a lover of exotic cars, owning a 1938 Buick, traded in for a Chevrolet and then a Studebaker. His widow Anne-Marie had become involved in the company and was responsible for the successful girdle called Little X. At its peak, the Silhouette business was the second largest employer in Shrewsbury after Rolls-Royce's Sentinel Works. Anne-Marie Lobenberg died in 1971, preceded a year earlier by her stepson George, who sadly, like his father, died at a relatively young age. Sadly, the name of Silhouette was to disappear from the local and national business scene in somewhat unfortunate circumstances. In 1980, the company was sold to W. L. Pawson, which went into receivership not long afterwards, depriving the town of several hundred jobs. Hans, George and Anne-Marie Lobenberg are buried at the top end of the 1931 extension to the cemetery, close to a number of other members of Silhouette staff, in an area still known within the family as Silhouette Corner. For many years the name of Della Porter was well known for the large store which stood in High Street. It all began when Joseph Della Porter left his home in Moltresio on the western shore of Lake Cosmo in Italy. He came to England, and after a period of time living in Birmingham, where he married Rosa Pavarelli, he came to Shrewsbury in 1857. They opened a small shop in Princess Street as a general dealer and laid the foundation for the future family business. He extended into Lloyd's Mansion, a 1570 building adjacent to his shop, where he expanded his product lines. A trade review in 1869 reported all classes of the community flocked to the establishment, for certainly nowhere in the county and hardly out of it can be such a vast and multitudinous array of goods, while in regard to prices, advantages are offered that would be extremely difficult to duplicate. Their annual Christmas displays were advertised under slogans such as the House of Christmas Plenty to the Treasure House of Toys. Joseph passed away in 1904 and Rosa in 1909. Their son, Joseph Lewis Della Porter, took control of the business. In the 1920s, the opportunity arose to expand and update the business premises, which resulted in the new unified store spreading between Princess Street and High Street. Joseph Lewis died in 1929, leaving his son Joseph William to run the business. He was the last family member to be actively involved in the business. In 1948, the business was purchased by the department store chain Hyde & Co., who ran Della Porter's as a subsidiary, while another Shrewsbury business purchased by Hyde & Co. in 1950, Drapers Edwin Powell & Son, being run by Della Porter's. The business continued to grow, and by 1957 the store had over 40 departments. In 1975, Hyde & Co. was purchased by House of Fraser, who rebranded the store under the Rackham's name. It changed its name from Rackham's to House of Fraser, but sadly closed its doors for good in January 2019, and the building has stood empty since. Mary Webb was born Mary Gladys Meredith in 1881 at Leighton Lodge in the Shropshire village of Leighton, where she was baptised at St Mary's Parish Church. Her father, George Edward Meredith, a private school teacher, inspired his daughter with his own love of literature and the local countryside. Her mother, Sarah Alice, was descended from a family related to Sir Walter Scott. Mary explored the countryside around her childhood home and developed a sense of detailed observation and description of both people and places, which later infused her poetry and prose. At the age of 1 year, she moved with her parents to Much Wenlock, where they lived at a house called the Grange outside the town. Mary was taught by her father, then sent to a finishing school for girls at Southport in 1895. Her parents moved the family again in Shropshire, north to Stanton upon Hine Heath in 1896, before settling in 1902 at Meal Brace, now on the outskirts of Shrewsbury. At the age of 20, she developed symptoms of Graves' disease, a thyroid disorder that resulted in bulging, protuberant eyes and throat goiter. It caused ill health throughout her life and probably contributed to her early death. This affliction resulted in her being empathetic with the suffering. She is considered to have created a fictional counterpart in the disfiguring harelip of Prue Sarn, the heroine of Precious Bane. Webb's first published writing was a 5-verse poem written on hearing news of the Shrewsbury rail accident in October 1907. Her brother Kenneth Meredith so liked the poem and thought it potentially comforting for those affected by the disaster that without her knowledge he took it to the newspaper offices of the Shrewsbury Chronicle, which printed the poem anonymously. Mary, who usually burnt her early poems, was appalled before learning that the newspaper had received appreciative letters from its readers. In 1912, Webb married Henry Bertram Law Webb, a teacher at Millbrace's Holy Trinity Parish Church. Henry was the nephew of the famous Captain Matthew Webb from Dawley in Shropshire, the first person to swim the English Channel. The couple married at Holy Trinity Church at Millbrace. The 70 guests were mainly old and destitute people she had come to know, mostly from Crosshouse's workhouse. Her only bridesmaid was 3.5-year-old Winifred, daughter of the family's gardener, Tom Downs. At first, Henry supported her literary interests. They lived for a time in Weston-super-Mare, but Mary wasn't able to settle in Somerset. The Webbs returned to Shropshire in 1914 and rented an isolated cottage in Pontesbury. The prospect of a rural life in Shropshire with Henry home all day was a source of deep happiness to Mary. They planned to live on the allowance she received from Scott family funds, supplemented by income from her writing. It was in Pontesbury that she completed The Golden Arrow and wrote her second novel, Gone to Earth. The publication of The Golden Arrow in 1917 enabled them to move to Lith Hill, Baston Hill, a place she loved, where they bought a plot of land and built Spring Cottage. Mary's health began to deteriorate again. She suffered her first serious attack of Graves' disease since before her marriage, and this was accompanied by bouts of depression. In 1921 they bought a second property in Bayswater, London, in the hope that by being in the city she could achieve greater literary recognition. This, however, did not happen. By 1926 her health was failing as well as her marriage. Henry was forming a close friendship with one of his ex-pupils, Kathleen Wilson, whom he would later marry. Kathleen even accompanied them on trips back to Spring Cottage. Mary spent the summer of 1927 alone at Spring Cottage, and in late September, though almost too ill to make the journey, travelled to St Leonard's in Sussex to be close to her former governess, Miss Lowry. Mary died in a nursing home in St Leonard's on the 8th of October at the age of 46. Her body was returned to Shropshire on a fine October afternoon. She was buried beneath a lime tree in the higher part of the cemetery, from where the hills of home could be seen in the distance. Gathered round her grave were Henry, members of her family, including her brother Kenneth, Miss Lowry, and several friends from Lith Hill. Her writing in general was received as notable for poetic descriptions of nature. Another aspect throughout her work was a close and fatalistic view on human psychology. She won the Prix Femina v Heureuse for Precious Bain. After her death, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin brought about her commercial success when, at a dinner of the Royal Literary Fund in 1928, he referred to her as a neglected genius. Consequently, her collected works were republished in the standard edition by Jonathan Cape, becoming bestsellers in the 1930s and running into many editions. Julia Bainbridge Whiteman, née James, was born in 1815, the daughter of Lieutenant Colonel James of Bath. She was of aristocratic descent and could trace her family line from King Edward III. Reverend Charles Edward Leopold Whiteman was the grandson of a Russian prince, and his mother was a companion and friend of Princess Charlotte, and his three names were given by his three godparents: the Princess Charlotte, Edward Duke of Kent, the father of Queen Victoria, and Prince Leopold of Belgium. Julia and Charles married in 1842, and initially Julia's father objected to the match as he thought being a vicar's wife was not a suitable life for her. He eventually relented when she became ill with grief. On marriage, Julia moved into the vicarage at St Altman's and began her lifelong commitment to work amongst the poor and destitute. Initially she began her efforts on the area of Butcher Row, at that time a poverty-stricken area, squalid and vice-ridden. Realising that the degradation was a result of drunkenness, she threw herself into a campaign against it. She believed in abstinence rather than temperance, and to fill the time that would have been spent in public houses, she established Bible classes and night schools for working class men. Charles Whiteman had been educated at Lincoln's College, Oxford, taking his BA in 1835. After a curacy in Salford near Bristol, an arrangement was made with the Crown that his father should vacate St Altman's in favour of his son. Charles ministered in that parish for more than 52 years. After a lifetime's work for the cause of abstinence, Mrs Whiteman died on the 14th of January 1898. Her husband had died 3 years previously. The two were buried together at a spot chosen by them just before Reverend Whiteman's final illness. Bishop Arthur William Powell was born in 1852 and educated at Shrewsbury School. From boyhood days he'd wished to become a missionary, and after university was ordained, then offered his services to the Church Missionary Society and went to Masulipatanam in India to work in 1877. In 1883 he was consecrated as the Bishop of Japan, where he was warmly received. He had suffered with ill health for a number of years and had to return home. He died in Shrewsbury in 1885, aged 33. Arthur was a member of St Altman's parish and knew the Whitemans well. Reverend Whiteman and his wife Julia were staying in Barmouth at the time of his death, and Charles Whiteman returned home to take his friend's funeral service. Poole Gakuin University in Osaka, Japan bears his name as it developed from the church school he started and now has over 1,000 students. George Arthur Rowley was born in Wolverhampton in April 1926, and Arthur, as he was always known, may have burst onto the scene earlier but for World War II. He showed early promise and signed for Wolverhampton Wanderers as an amateur before moving to arch rivals West Bromwich Albion in May 1944. After the Football League restarted in 1946, Arthur made his initial 24 appearances for the Baggies before moving south to join Fulham in December 1948. His eye for goal began to become apparent as he scored 27 goals in 56 starts for the Craven Cottage Club and helped them to promotion in 1949 to the top flight. He was to return to the second division with Leicester City, where he became, and still is, an icon. Having joined them as Town were just entering the league, he would rewrite the record books. The Foxes earned promotion twice, largely thanks to Rowley's phenomenal strike rate. In 303 games for the side, he scored 251 goals, which helped them to promotion in 1954 and 1957. In those days, footballers over 30 years of age were often discarded by top-flight clubs, and in their early days, Shrewsbury Town benefited from the skills of many ex-Derby County players while Sammy Crooks was in charge. However, it was a big surprise that Leicester City decided to unload 31-year-old Rowley, and a major coup that Town secured his services. He arrived saying that his team would look to score goals and he would rather win 5-4 than 1-0. At the time, the club record goal scorer was Willie O'Donnell with 19 in the season. In his first campaign, Arthur doubled that figure and the team scored over 100 goals in the league, a feat they repeated in all fixtures for the next 2 seasons. In 7 years as a player, he played 236 games for Salop and scored 152 goals to become the club's all-time record scorer. Only Danny Williams before the war and Jackie Butler afterwards passed 100. He also beat all the British goal-scoring records, passing Dixie Dean's 379 English goals, Hughie Gallagher's 387 Anglo-Scottish total, and latterly Jimmy McCrory's 410-goal Scottish record, as he amassed 434 goals in a 619-game career. He finished his playing career at the Town, hanging up his boots in 1965, although he stayed on as manager for another 3 years. He was player-manager, and Shrewsbury beat First Division giants Everton in the League Cup and were within minutes of reaching the final before losing out to Rotherham. Rowley left Shrewsbury to manage Sheffield United and Southend, but returned to the Town when he retired and was regularly seen at Gay Meadow, and his last game, the home encounter against Bournemouth, was just days before he died. Sadly, he died only a few weeks before Shrewsbury Town's FA Cup victory over Premiership club Everton, a game he would have enjoyed immensely. After all, as Town manager, he too had beaten the Toffees in the League Cup. But then he also didn't live to see the string of awful performances that led to Town's relegation to the conference in May 2003. Arthur Rowley died at the age of 76 in December 2002. His record tally of 434 league goals is unlikely ever to be broken. John Charles Henry Bowdler, also known as Jack Bowdler and sometimes Charlie, was a Welsh footballer. He was part of the Wales national football team between 1890 and 1894, playing 5 matches and scoring 3 goals. He played his first match on the 8th of February 1890 against Ireland and his last match on the 12th of March 1894 against England. He played at club level for Shrewsbury Town, of which he was a founder player, Wolverhampton Wanderers and Blackburn Rovers prior to beginning his practice as a solicitor. Bowdler was born in 1870, son of John Charles Bowdler, a Shrewsbury solicitor. Harry Ernest Bowdler, also known as Ernie, another Wales football international, was his brother. He was educated at Shrewsbury School, which he attended from 1884 to 1888. He was admitted a solicitor in 1895 after serving articles under John Hawley Edwards, a former England and Wales international footballer and another solicitor in Shrewsbury. He practised in the town lifelong with offices in Swan Hill. From 1901 to his death, he sat as a Conservative member for Bellevue Ward on Shrewsbury Borough Council and was Conservative agent for the Shrewsbury constituency under its then MPs Sir Clement Lloyd Hill and George Butler Lloyd. During the First World War, he served as a corporal in the Shropshire Regiment of the Volunteer Training Corps. He married in 1901 Agnes, daughter of Benjamin Timmis, farmer of Westbury, Shropshire, and had 3 sons and a daughter. He died from heart failure at his home, Oakfield House in South Hermitage, Bellevue, Shrewsbury, on the 18th of July 1927, aged 56. He was described in his obituary as a speedy winger and a deadly shot in goal. Bowdler was in the Shrewsbury School's school football 11 from 1885 to 1888, being team captain in the latter year. It was while at school he and his brother became players at Shrewsbury Town in 1886. He later served on the committee of the club as secretary and chairman and once maintained the club for a whole month at his own expense during the early 1900s. He played for Shrewsbury Town up to 1890 and again during 1893. Bowdler later joined Wolverhampton Wanderers, with whom he played in the FA Cup ties of the seasons of 1889-90 to semi-final, when Wolves were beaten 1-0 by Cup winners Blackburn Rovers, 1890-91 and 1891-92. He transferred to Blackburn Rovers, with whom he played in the FA Cup competitions of 1892-93 to semi-final, when Rovers were ironically beaten 1-0 by Wolves, and 1893-94. Both clubs, unlike Shrewsbury Town in his lifetime, were in the Football League. He gave up playing with Rovers prior to beginning his legal practice in 1895. Bowdler participated in Shrewsbury School athletics and was senior whip of the Royal Shrewsbury School Hunt, in fact the school's cross-country running club, also known as the Harriers, in 1888. He also played Crown Green Bowls as a member of the Shrewsbury Seven-Side Bowling Club and took part in a number of inter-county matches. Once qualified as a solicitor, Jack set up his own law firm, which became J.C.H. Bowdler & Son, when his son Charles later joined him. The firm remained prominent in the commercial landscape of Shrewsbury until 1988, when part of it merged with Lanyon's to become Lanyon Bowdler. The remainder of the original firm continued under the name of John Bowdler's and is still run today in Swan Hill. Harry Ernest Bowdler was brother to John Charles Henry Bowdler. Harry Ernest, known as Ernie, was born in 1872 and was also a footballer of considerable renown. Between them, they are said to have played a part in establishing the original Shrewsbury Town Football Club, whilst both were still at Shrewsbury School. Unlike his brother, however, Ernie never played in the Football League, though he did achieve 1 Welsh cap whilst a Shrewsbury Town player. He was a clever winger but had little chance to shine as Wales went down 8-0 to Scotland in 1891. Nevertheless, in the forward line, which also included his brother Jack on the opposite wing, he was said in match reports to be the fastest and best in front of goal. Ernie hit the headlines at the end of the 1892-93 season, when in the final league game at home to St George's, play came to an end 15 minutes early due to a pitch invasion. This occurred after Fowler, the visitors' right back, kicked out at Bowdler, and his father went onto the pitch to remonstrate with the errant defender. Ernie continued to play locally for Shrewsbury Town until 1901 and, like his father and brother before him, joined the legal profession and held several appointments in the town. Ernie died on the 24th of May 1921 at the early age of 48 from appendicitis and was buried near to the other members of the Bowdler family. Unfortunately, I couldn't find Ernie's grave. Thomas Corbett was a founder member of Salop County Council and then entered borough politics in 1904, serving as an alderman from 1910 until his death in 1917. But it's a businessman that he'll be best remembered. His father was a master at the ironworks in Wellington, and after working for a while in his father's firm, he came to Shrewsbury in 1863 to the Perseverance Ironworks in St Michael's Street. When the owner retired, Corbett and a Mr. Chipcase bought the firm. The firm painted and made many types of agricultural equipment and exhibited at many agricultural shows across the UK and Europe, and also meeting royalty. He was a founder member of the Shropshire and West Midland Agricultural Society, and as secretary helped promote the first show in 1876. His works were damaged by a major fire in 1905, and Corbett narrowly escaped death when a wall collapsed by him. His designs were saved and the firm continued until the 1920s, and the buildings are now Morris Lubricants. Thomas Southam was a Conservative and, besides being elected Mayor of Shrewsbury on 3 separate occasions, served on the Town Council for a total of 44 years. In a speech of tribute to him, Alderman W.L. Brown said to tell his life story was like telling Shrewsbury's story during the same period. Besides his service on the council, he was a long-serving borough magistrate, a county magistrate, director of Shrewsbury Workhouse and vice-chairman of the Atcham Poor Law Union. It is perhaps in his role as a local businessman, however, that he made the biggest impact. His father was a corn merchant from Bridgnorth who later moved to Shrewsbury, and young Thomas began his career as a counter clerk for another merchant in town. In 1842 he set up his own business as a wine and ale merchant in Wild Cop. The company gradually grew and flourished, so that by 1886 it had its own brewery known as the Old Sallet Brewery in Chester Street, where the Gateway Centre now stands. A branch in Ludlow followed, and by 1900 the company owned 20 public houses in the Shrewsbury area. The business continued to thrive and was eventually bought by Threlfalls in 1967. Thomas Southam died on the 31st of December 1895 at the age of 77, but until recently his memory lived on, as he could be seen in his full mayoral robes on the inn sign of the Proud Slopian on Smithfield Road. The pub had previously been a Southam's Inn. Sadly, both the name and the sign have now disappeared. William Heath met his death in a tragic accident at Shrewsbury Station forecourt on the 8th of January 1887. He was a coal merchant from Old Heath by Divrington and had been a member of Shrewsbury Town Council. He entered the forecourt and, having spoke to a local shopkeeper, went looking for a cab. The cab is sheltered under a canopy attached to the brick wall, and Heath entered the cab stand to find a cabby, only for the canopy to collapse on top of him. The collapse had been caused by a large amount of snow on the roof, which had slipped, causing immense pressure, tearing it from the wall. Heath was found in a kneeling position with 2 rafters resting on his shoulders. Both legs had been broken, as well as a number of ribs, and he was declared dead by a local doctor. More could have been trapped by the collapse, but it was hailing time, and the cabbies had moved outside. His inquest examined in detail the construction of the canopy, and also the fact that the debris had been removed before full investigation could take place. The verdict was accidental death, but expressed the view that the stand was not properly constructed. William Henry Carter lived in Coton Mount and was a fireman with the Great Western Railway. Aged 28, married with 3 children, he was working as the fireman on a goods train from Pontypool Road for Shrewsbury on the 10th of August 1928. It pulled into Coton Hill alongside a water column, and he remained on the footplate to refuel coal and water. He pulled the chain to operate the filling mechanism, which then snapped and he fell 8 feet to the ground. Paralysed from the waist down, he was taken to the station on a shunting engine, but never recovered from his injuries. The inquest found that the chain was faulty, but was scathing in the care that he had received. A Dr. Bridgman giving evidence stressed that extreme care was needed when dealing with spinal injuries, and that lifting the victim's head would lead to instant death. A verdict of accidental death was recorded. A huge thank you to Stan Sedman for sharing his cemetery tour notes with me, and also I got some of the information from this book here about Shrewsbury Cemetery. The rest I found on the internet. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Remember, stay safe everyone.